you stand when it comes to the vote on leaving or remaining?
We have 4 months to make up our mind, and I'm in no
Have you
rush.
made up your mind?
I have not made up my mind. I will wait until we...
You're up for grabs?
Well, I'm sure I'm not the only one. I think what we really need is a debate where people have a chance to see the arguments and the facts and take their time to make up their own mind.
Now, there are several pages in the book where you talk about the last referendum, the Scottish independence referendum, and you think that on the currency debate, which raged throughout that campaign, both sides avoided talking about sterlingisation, which you think would have been the option to go for.
Yes, so I was disappointed in both sides in the referendum. I thought there was an answer that would solve the independence question, the currency issue, and that is that nothing happened. Scotland just carries on using sterling, and I think that would have been totally feasible. There was no need for an independent currency. That wouldn't have posed any threat or difficulty for an independent Scotland, and I see absolutely no reason why it would have caused a problem for the Bank of England to allow banks to carry on functioning in Scotland. Now, of course, the reason why this wasn't proposed was because it would be absolutely clear on the one side that independence would actually give Scotland no greater independence in monetary policy than at present. So the independent argument didn't find that attractive. On the other hand, those who wanted to argue for the Union said it would be a disaster if Scotland were to leave, and I think that was an exaggeration. And I worry that if just as in the referendum on the European Union, that if the two sides exaggerate the arguments, then it becomes much, much harder for people to make up their minds. The
Chancellor at the time ruled out very, very forcefully a monetary union. Do you think that that might have been different after a yes vote if that had happened?
Well, it might have been. We'll never know.
But what I mean, it was just after your period as governor. Do you think that might have been the way they'd go though?
I think it would have been exceptionally difficult, because for a country to leave the United Kingdom and then to say, can we come back into the monetary union straight away, would I think have been very difficult. But the approach of saying we will just carry on using sterling would have been a perfectly acceptable and feasible option.
And do you think that is the way it will go if we have another independence referendum during the debate? Because you think we will, don't you?
Well, I don't know whether we'll have a referendum or not. And as I
You suggest in the book that it's fairly likely that there will be, because the question hasn't been settled.
Well, this is the fear I have about the referendum as it happened in Scotland in 2014 and again now on the European Union, which is if people vote because they're frightened of the possible consequences, but not really convinced deep down that they know the answer, then they naturally feel somewhat resentful afterwards that they were pressured to vote in a certain way, and therefore the question never is settled. Now, I personally have always felt that I'd be very, very sad if Scotland were to leave the Union, because as an Englishman, I have benefited enormously from feeling I'm part of a union with Scotland. So I don't want Scotland to leave because I feel I'm better off with Scotland in the Union. But obviously it's the people in Scotland who will decide for themselves. But we've benefited so much from this link in England. But what we shouldn't do is to say to people in Scotland, you should be frightened of being on your own.
You conclude that the audacity of pessimism is our best hope, which sounds terribly gloomy, looking ahead.
I think it ought to be a matter of optimism, because the only way you tackle problems is to face up to them. And I think if you deny that there is a problem, whether it's in the banking system, whether it's in the global economy, then eventually the problems will catch up with you. But if you recognise the seriousness of the problems and decide to do something about it, if you have the courage, or as I call it, the audacity of pessimism, then you can get through to a period where I think in the future we have very good reason to be optimistic, because there's so many young people in the areas of science and technology are producing, and I saw many of them in Scotland earlier this week, are producing ideas, innovations, techniques that will improve our productivity in the future, and that's the basis of higher living standards for all of us in the future.
Lord King, thanks very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
The SNP meets in Glasgow this weekend for a spring conference, where the leadership will look to rally the faithful ahead of the upcoming Holyrood elections. Among the thousands present will be the party's former leader, Alex Salmond. He spoke to us from Edinburgh. Alex Salmond, we've just heard from the former governor of the Bank of England saying that sterlingisation could have been the answer to the currency debate during the independence referendum. Did you miss a trick?
Well, let me say that both in the interview and indeed in the book, even more forthrightly, Mervyn King puts forward a very reasonable case. And he says, for example, that the No campaign were misleading, that they were scaremongering, that they were trying to pretend that Scotland couldn't be a small, successful, independent country, which was clearly not the case. And that's very powerful stuff from the former governor of the Bank of England. And he also explains why sterlingisation, Plan B, if you like, would have worked effectively. But if you remember the debate with Alistair Darling, I did make this point during the debate when Alistair Darling finally admitted that there was no bar on Scotland using sterling if we so wanted, because it's an internationally tradable currency. So it wasn't the option we put forward as our first option, but certainly it emerged later in the debate and very powerfully, and that has now been underlined in an excellent contribution by Mervyn King.
I don't seem to remember it as powerful a part of the debate as you did, because it wasn't even one of the big four that the Fiscal Commission originally proposed in 2013.
Well, it was listed in the Fiscal Commission.
It was, but it was listed as an aside.
No, it was not a side. It was listed.
No, actually, I'll quote you. It says, as an aside, there is an option for Scotland to adopt sterling through an informal process of sterlingisation. Right, so it was an aside.
It wasn't the key recommendation, and that's because that was based before George Osborne delivered his sermon on the pound, putting this bar on using sterling. Now, Mervyn King, of course, once said to me that the trouble I had was that what they said during the campaign and what they would say the day after the referendum, if it was a yes vote, as he put it, two entirely different things. As I called it, that was the King dictum. And that was the truth of the matter, and he's told the truth yet again. But
although he doesn't say that in the book either. He says that they would have stood by their commitment not to allow you into a currency union.
Yeah, but, OK, look, the key point is this, Colin. During the debate, if I can remind you, the second debate with Alistair Darling, the key admission for Alistair Darling, which effectively destroyed the unionist case on this subject, was when he said, of course, nobody can stop you using sterling, which was precisely the opposite of what the Chancellor of the Exchequer had been saying. That's why the No campaign at that point had their head in their hands. So we got there in the debate, and I think by the end of the debate on Scottish independence, then that aspect had, if not been put to bed, then certainly the No campaign were very much in headlong retreat.
So initially then, when you were doing that first debate on STV, did you miss that trick on pushing for sterlingisation? Because if you think, as he suggests, it would have stolen their thunder, maybe you should have gone down that route.
Well, yeah, sure. And I think we should have listed the options as I did in the second debate. If you remember, I said not just a plan B, but here's C, D and E. And I went through all of the different currency options that various countries had, leading to the very central point made forcibly in Mervyn King's book, that of course Scotland could be a small, successful European economy, and it was ridiculous and, as he says, misleading for the No campaign to pretend otherwise.
He also says that currency doesn't have to be the centre of the debate on the future of Scotland. He admits in his book that there may well be another referendum. Would you support sterlingisation as the currency option in a second independence referendum then?
Well, let's see what emerges at that time. And it's not for me to choose the currency options. Can I remind you, the options that we put forward were put forward by a committee of economists containing 2 Nobel laureates. They weren't in the back of a fag packet like the No campaign.
But does it appeal to you at the moment?
Campaign. But, well, as I used it in the debate, and as Sterling King has put it forward, when Mervyn King has put it forward, it's a very reasonable option to have. But the choice of which options to put forward will be the responsibility of those who are arguing the independence case at that time.
Yeah, but you'll be arguing the independence case at that time, won't you?
Yes, but let's say, for example, let's take this scenario, shall we, Colin? Let's say we get this Brexit against my wishes, against the campaign of the SNP, but Scotland votes heavily in favour of the European Union. Let's say there then is a Euro referendum, a European referendum, or an independence referendum on the back of that scenario, and which the opinion polls say that 60% of folk would vote yes under these circumstances. Then that will be up to Nicola Sturgeon to put forward the platform on which the independence case is based.
But I bet she'll speak to you about it, and I bet she'll ask what you think about it, and will you say, let's go for sterlingisation this time?
And that's a contribution I'll make to Nicola Sturgeon, and then she'll make the choice of the independence case. I think it's much better if the person who's primarily responsible puts forward the arguments, and those of us who are there to support her do exactly that.
Well, you've got the SNP Spring Conference this weekend in Glasgow. About 3,000 delegates there. It's fair grown since you left, hasn't it?
Yes, well, certainly, but there's been a huge momentum, and I think it's absolutely fantastic. And listen, I thought I was doing pretty well in 2011, getting an overall majority in a proportional system, something that people said could never be done. We broke the system, but I mean, that's as of nothing compared to the dizzy heights that Nicola Sturgeon is currently reaching in the opinion polls. What I would say, just as a cautionary note, and I know this is something that Nicola supports, these things are never foregone conclusions. You have to work hard for every single vote. And it's tough to get an overall majority in a proportional system, and therefore if people want to see that excellent SNP government under Nicola Sturgeon continuing and defending Scotland's interests, then they've got to vote SNP both votes.
And you've got your final speech as an MSP in the Scottish Parliament next week. What are you going to have to tell the nation?
Well, I'm thinking about it now, but it's going to be interesting. I was sitting in the Parliament today and voting on the legislation that was coming forward today. And I was thinking just about how I might introduce the speech. I understand it may be quite early in the morning next Wednesday, and because one of the great advantages of being First Minister is you never had to speak much till the afternoon. But I'll be up early making that contribution.
But you've been the longest serving First Minister in the Scottish Parliament that Scotland's had. What have been the biggest kind of challenges that you had to deal with in your time? Was it the release of McGrahy? Was it the referendum? What was it?
Oh, the highlight was definitely the referendum campaign. In terms of the policy changes we introduced then, certainly I'm most proud of reintroducing free education in Scotland. I think that's absolutely vital to the future of the country. We had lots of crises, the swine flu crisis, the various other things that happened. I think we handled them pretty well. But maybe I'll reflect next week on the evolution of the Parliament. I was in the first Parliament in 1999. I was First Minister in the Parliament we have now. Nicola Sturgeon's leading the Parliament and the country forward. So I think maybe a wee bit of reflection on how the Parliament has grown as an institution to become undoubtedly the focus of Scottish politics, the great inquest of the nation. And I was reflecting today that nobody would gainsay the idea that A, this is a Parliament, secondly, that it's led by a government. If you remember, when I took over, it was just an executive. And thirdly, the body politic in Scotland, and above all, the people of Scotland, look to their Parliament for leadership, which is exactly what they're getting at the present moment.
Given that in 2 weeks' time we would have been on the eve of Independence Day if you'd won the referendum, when do you think the likelihood is that there might be another one?
Well, I think these things depend on circumstances, and the most immediate credible circumstance, the material change in circumstances, Nicola Sturgeon put it in last year's general election, would be in the scenario of a UK Brexit with Scotland voting in, and it by a big majority. That contrast with Scotland dragged out of Europe against its will. My view is that would almost certainly make the demand for an early referendum on Scottish independence irresistible.
Do you think that's likely?
No, I think it's likely to be an in-vote over the UK, is my opinion. But I think
so
it's very
on
much,
that basis, then, when do you expect the possible Indy Ref 2 then? Are you looking at 2021, 2022?
Well, let me finish the sentence, Colin. Very much subject to events. You see, I was also struck in Mervyn King's interview when he was talking about both sides exaggerating during the European referendum at the present moment and bemoaning the fact. And actually, I think that's more of a problem for the in campaign, because the two campaigns have been very, very negative. And if you get two negative campaigns, then any big event can blow things off course, because people are not being given something to believe in, something really positive.
You're not going to give me a definition of it. You're not going to give me your latest definition of a generation, though, are you?
Well, I'll tell you what. I think there will be another independence referendum in Scotland. I think the yes side will win it next time round. The question is, of course, the timescale. I think the destination is set, but the timetable is a bit more difficult to determine.
Alex Salmond, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Pleasure, thank you.
Well, let's move on now and get a roundup of the latest news and sport.